problem, which made drawing this border very, very difficult. And as many of you will know, on June 6th, 2000, never get Independence Day exactly right.
Is that South Sudan?
Yeah, South Sudan becomes independent.
2008?
So it was...
2008. It was like 3 years ago?
No, it was in 2011.
Oh.
Yeah. But very recently, South Sudan has become independent. Now, this was intended to basically solve the problems, to a large extent, with the North-South Civil War. So the North-South Civil War ends with a peace deal called the CPA, which gives the South an option of a referendum on secession, which they take with like 94% of the vote in a referendum in 2008, I think it was. Anyway, they all vote to secede, they secede. Now, how's it worked? Well, arguably, but there's still an ongoing border conflict here. In particular, there's a very oil-rich region called Abyei, and no one can really decide who Abyei should belong to. So that's a massive problem. There's a lot of fighting over that. There's also a massive problem that the SPLA has now kind of split into factions. That a lot of the Nuer versus Dinka tribal conflict has been reignited. They're like killing each other again. So there's a lot of violence in South Sudan. And also, South Sudan was now free of northern control and controlling quite a bit of oil, has basically all of the things that are worst for a state trying to become successful. It's landlocked, which is typically very bad for states because it makes it very hard for them to trade if their neighbours are unstable. It's exceptionally poor. It's like one of the poorest countries in the world. A 14-year-old girl in South Sudan has a greater chance of dying in childbirth than she does being in school. So this really is, when I said please don't think about Africa as like just a basket case where everybody has AIDS and dying. South Sudan is like about the closest you get to somewhere that's properly screwed. Although, no AIDS, very little AIDS, it's not really an issue there, so that's a plus. And also it's still being attacked by the North, and to a large extent the North controls a lot of its trade routes, it still controls a lot of its oil, and it's only got one political force. One of the problems of having a liberatory movement that frees you from your oppressor is that they're the only political game in town. So it's not clear who's really going to create the meaningful opposition to the SPLA that gets their policies challenged. Does anybody have any Sudan-based questions?
On the south people are also Muslims?
No, they're Christian.
What exactly happened during these years?
That was the Civil War. So there's a civil war between the
how
North
long
and South.
it was?
Yeah, 21 years.
What does the SPLA stand for?
Sudan People's Liberation Army. It's the Southern Army.
And why do we believe that al-Bashir let South Sudan go relatively peacefully instead of kicking off the war again?
I mean, he's kicked off the war quite a bit over oil-rich regions. Partly, it's not like having a long war was particularly good for the North. The SPLA also started to scare Bashir a bit in elections because they kept winning an inconveniently large proportion of the vote. And in particular, a lot of Northerners started voting for the SPLA because Bashir is a pretty bad, pretty oppressive man. So arguably it cements his control over the North. I mean, I also think there's like a non-zero chance that if South Sudan had seceded totally lawfully and with the North's arguable consent, and then he'd invaded, the international community would have destroyed him. So,
What problems does the North have at the moment?
well, it's got a lot less oil than it used to because a lot of the oil is located in the south. It only has one political force. Its president can't go to most foreign countries because he's wanted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. Massive refugee problems because a lot of your Northern Arab that lived in the south, you've had to move north of the border. So there's huge internal displacement issues. Like, it's less badly off than the south, but not by an awful lot.
But if the South has the oil, are they just not utilising it properly at the moment, or are things still being blown up there?
So part of the problem is that the peace deal still mandates a certain amount of revenue sharing between the north and south, because otherwise the north wouldn't have been able to let the south go. Part of it is like extracting oil is quite difficult, and you need political stability to get international companies to come in and extract your oil for you. Like oil, it's very
Isn't Shell
capital
there?
intensive. Yeah, they're there, they're trying, but not perhaps in the quantities that they should be. And also, where do you pipe it out? You can only pipe it out through the north if you want to get out of the country, or you have to go through alternative and also relatively unstable neighbours.
Speculative question. You have researched Africa.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And can you offer or speculate what, if any, the Western world can do in order to improve the current state of events in the south of Sudan?
I mean, get the oil flowing is a pretty big thing. If international companies get involved, that will probably require a large amount of assistance from the international community. They're probably also going to need aid to do things like building schools. Like, it really is a pretty screwed up country. I think that's a very, very big question. Like, all of the things we try and do in post-conflict states, which are very weak. But I don't really know. I mean, there's just so much stuff that we can do, like trying to make sure that it doesn't turn violent again. I'm not really quite sure I understand what the question is.
Yeah. And that matter, do you believe, as you said...
I have. If your question is it going to like be screwed up in the future?
No.
Okay.
Assuming that our experience in trying to resolving problems in many conflict countries in Africa usually fail. Do you believe we have a moral justification to continue trying due to the fact that it usually fucks up?
Saying that it usually, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily true to say that it usually fucks up. I think often we don't hear about the interventions that succeed as much as the ones that fail, in part because there are fewer consequences. So like, French intervention in the Ivory Coast, for instance, recently was very, very effective. It got Gbagbo out, he's now awaiting trial in The Hague. It got the democratically elected winner of those elections in, and it prevented the Ivory Coast lapsing back into civil war. And there's a very successful British mission to end the conflict in Sierra Leone. South Africa and the AU's behest intervened incredibly effectively in Angola in the early 2000s. There are lots of examples of successful interventions, you just don't necessarily hear about them. I'd say we definitely have a moral obligation to make our interventions better, but that's not quite the same thing. Yeah.
Can you briefly outline like the African Union? What does it do?
Okay, so the African Union is basically all of the countries in Africa in a European Union style federation, though much less extensive. The principal things it does are, there's a move towards economic cooperation, so there's a move towards reducing trade tariffs, which are a massive issue in Africa. In one particular thing, that if it is able to do this, will actually, I think, make a massive difference, is the creation of an African single currency, which they've unfortunately provisionally dubbed the Afro. But they do want to create an African central bank that would issue the Afro.
Which would be as successful as the Eurozone?
Well, but obviously you have to compare it to African currencies at the moment, which are just absurdly volatile. And to the extent it's very, very difficult to ever invest in many African countries because of currency volatility.
But how would that not make the whole thing not volatile, like in the EU?
Well, I don't think it necessarily, because it's, the comparison is different, right? You're not trading off against,
But you have some countries with incredibly high inflation rates, like absolutely crazy high inflation rates, and countries who are relatively
Sure, but a large part of the reason for that is very poor central banking. which is one of the things that an African central bank is intended to correct.
But they're taking a module that has worked in a relatively more stable environment,
But
and
that's-
somewhere that's even less stable.
But that's exactly the reason that I think it's more likely to be comparatively successful. As in, Europe didn't have enormous currency stability problems before the creation of the euro. It was intended as like a relatively small game. Whereas for Africa, the creation of any kind of currency stability would be a massive deal. Similarly, getting any central bank credibility at all would be an amazing win for the African continent. So yeah, the creation of the Afro, the enormous thing that it does, which is actually relatively significant, is that if there's a military coup in your country, you'll be immediately expelled from the African Union, which also means that trade sanctions and diplomatic sanctions are placed on you. And that's proven relatively effective at getting coup leaders to hold democratic elections fairly quickly.
What is coup?
Oh, when the military takes over.
Ah, okay.
That's great.
Other Africa questions? Awesome. In which case, I think we're done.